I'm going to be talking about history today, particularly the different approaches or the different understandings of history between state-accredited programs and Lutheran schools. Classical schools are a subset of Lutheran schools, but I think this is something that applies more broadly. So I'm going to start with a couple of statements, and my thesis statement I think is on the second slide. So I want to start off by talking this thing about worldview. Eric and Mildred in her session yesterday talked about the importance of a worldview in establishing classroom management for teachers. This is also true when you're talking about your content. So a couple things we have to remember if we're comparing these two different versions of history. Here's the state-accredited program. Here is the Lutheran idea. There are significant similarities in the worldviews of Lutherans, Christians more generally, and mainstream society. There are profound differences in the worldviews of Lutherans and mainstream society. At which point you're saying, well, duh. Let's unpack that a little bit. So when I say we share similarities with mainstream society, this is what I'm talking about. So here's one way in which you conceptualize constructing a worldview. So we start with the individual, who is a member of the family. So the family in which an individual grows up shapes that individual. The family the individual in the context of the family is going to have personal experiences and have beliefs, which are going to be shaped by those inner circles. And then the individual exists within a community. This community may have ethnic or cultural implications for how the person looks at things. That all exists within a context of American history and culture, which itself developed and exists within a larger framework of Western civilization, and then that exists within the larger world. So this is what we all do as individuals. This is what makes the Christian view different. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. So the individual, so this really refers to the city of man. Right? This is the visible world. This is the physical. This is the physical, the mental. It doesn't have anything to do with the spiritual or the soul. That's where the city of man comes in. So the Christian then, the worldview is shaped by that engagement also in the city of God. But the Christian also, as a mortal, lives in the city of man. So how does this impact the view of history? Well, as in the worldview, the Christian view of history shares many similarities with that of non-Christians. However, there are things about the way in which the Christians view history that is fundamentally different from that of non-Christians. So this means that there are many commonalities in the way in which Lutheran schools and public or state-accredited programs teach history. Nevertheless, here's my thesis. Because the Christian view of history is different from that of non-Christians, the way in which history is approached in Lutheran schools should be distinct. So now I want to unpack this. I don't normally teach history backwards, but I'm going to try it today because I think it sort of explains, it gets you to my thesis. So I want to start with where we are now. So when we're talking about teaching history in the public state-accredited schools, what does it look like? And then I want to talk about how we got there. And then I want to talk about why this has ramifications for Christians. Okay. So if we look at history in schools in the early 21st century, we're going to spend a minute talking about the educational landscape. Because I'm also going to do this for the turn of the 20th century, and I want you to be able to make some comparisons. So first of all, when we talk about students, we have a very heterogeneous population in the United States in the year 2019. There are many people who are first generation, second generation, third generation immigrants. There are some people whose families can trace all the way back to the American Revolution. We also have in the United States compulsory education. It is law that students go to school. And the public schools in particular track this very carefully. I know that my younger son, they had the high school got a new automated system. Those of you avoid automated systems whenever possible. Whenever he was late to class, so the teacher marked him absent, it went into the system and it couldn't change it. I got 4 phone calls. Your child missed 1 or more class periods yesterday. He will be going to detention, or something like that. It's just kind of like, he was 2 minutes late, or maybe it's an error on the part of the teacher. So in other words, this is something that the public schools track very carefully. We have a system of schools all the way from early childhood all the way up through secondary and post-secondary, and they are designed to fit together. So there's a system. A lot of our education is driven by the economic structure. So in 2019, even though agriculture and industry is an important part of our economy, it is not as important a part as it once was. So the service industry, technology, some of these what we call white-collar jobs are more important economically speaking. So our education tends to be geared that way. And in terms of politics, the government, particularly at the national level, is much more directly involved in education in 2019 than it has been in the past. So all of this affects the way in which subjects are taught, the curriculum is structured, and it has ramifications for history. So when we talk about conceptualizing the past, we do so in two ways in terms of the school curriculum: social studies and history. So I want to sort of unpack what those two are and how we got them. So in the early 21st century, I'm going to talk about Wisconsin. That's my home state. So if you go onto the Wisconsin DPI website and you look for their social studies standards, this is what you're going to find. What do you notice? Do you notice that history is one part of a whole series of strands? And then notice this. There are 28 social studies standards identified. I really feel for my students who are going in the public education track when they're working on their portfolios, because they have to track and demonstrate mastery of 28 standards. Okay. So when we look at the narrative description from Wisconsin DPI and how they conceptualize social studies, what it is and what it's for, I have italicized some things, and I'm sorry, I wish I could get this larger, but I'm afraid to touch something for fear that it will disappear entirely. But can you see? Can anyone read that well enough to see the italicized words and which ones jump out at you? Okay, so that leads us to what's the emphasis, what's the point of social studies? Civic competence. So the aim of social studies is to produce citizens who are productive and who can collaborate in our interdependent world. And notice how we get them there. An integrated study of economics, geography, history, political science, and the behavioral sciences of psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Okay, so where did that come from? How do we get to this, this definition of social studies? All right, well, that comes from the National Council for Social Studies. The council itself was founded in 1922, and the foundation date is significant, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, so if you compare this definition, and the Wisconsin DPI site says that much of its definition comes from this definition. So what do you see here again? What is social studies and what's it for? Again, civic competence. What we are trying to then create are active citizens, and we want them to engage in civic issues such as healthcare, crime, foreign policy. But I also want you to notice how we're defining social studies. It's everything but the kitchen sink. And if they could get the kitchen sink in there, they'd probably put it in. Also notice this is it's not described as interdisciplinary. It's described as multidisciplinary. What's the difference?
They don't relate to each other.
No, it's just like, we're just gonna like throw things to the wall and see what sticks. Okay? So the objective is not bad. We do want active citizens. We do want them to be aware of social problems. We do want them to have notions of service, helping the neighbor. But the approach is somewhat problematic. So where did this come from? Or just one quick thing. So, if you're a student and you see this list, what's your automatic reaction. Right? So this is another problem that we have in the way in which we approach this. I'll talk about. Okay, then we have Common Core. Look what they have done to history and social studies. Do you notice that history and social studies doesn't even have its own strand? It's embedded within the ELA standard. So look at what we are emphasizing here. Skills. It's skill development. There is no content. There's no content there. There's just skill building. And it's not that the skills that they're wanting to develop are bad. That students should know how to read a primary document and analyze it. They should be able to tell the difference between fact and opinion. But you have to give them a frame of reference for doing so. Okay. So how do we get here to this social studies thing? As I like to put it, whence came social studies? There are debates about where social studies actually came from, meaning the curriculum. The concept of social studies emerged in the late 19th century as part of a larger social welfare reform movement. And it's not at all surprising why social reform was so badly needed. The first thing that's going to happen is this little document. This is the, not the final version of it, this is the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1865. That's followed shortly thereafter by the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which collectively did what? I'm testing your knowledge. What did these amendments do?
One ended slavery.
One ended slavery.
And
Citizenship. Yes, it's going to grant them citizenship and the right to vote. So think about this now. We have a large population of people who have now been granted citizenship, which do not have an education and who have not been trained for citizenship. Oh my gosh, we gotta do something. Okay? Then we're gonna throw in things like rapid urbanization. Since we're in Chicago, I thought I'd show you a picture of Chicago around the 1880s. This is probably in one of the more affluent neighborhoods. If you go into the working class neighborhoods, you find tenement houses, very close together, dirty, unsanitary. There's no, and again, there's no labor regulations in this particular period. No work, there's no work day. There is no OSHA looking after if you get injured on the job. So this is going to create a lot of chaos and instability, which leads, this one, let's do this one. This is also from Chicago. This is 1892. This is the Haymarket Square riot. This was a multi-day conflict. It started off with a labor protest, which ended in violence with the police. Several people on both sides were killed between day 1 and day 2. So if you're looking at this, you're thinking, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. And then we're going to throw in this. So in the 1890s, we have a massive increase in immigration to the United States. But what's different about this immigration is these people are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They speak different languages. They eat weird food. They dress funny. They're harder to assimilate into American culture, unlike the Germans who came in a couple decades before, who were from Northern Europe and shared many similarities, even if they're linguistically different. They still shared a lot of cultural characteristics with the Americans already here. These people are different. So if you're, again, a social reformer, you look at this, you're like, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. And then we have a lot of instability, political instability. This is an engraving of the assassination of Garfield in 1881. Let's not also forget there was another assassination in 1901. That's McKinley. That's how we got Teddy Roosevelt. And this is coming on the heels of the assassination of Lincoln in 1865. So once again, if you're an American citizen living through those times, there's a lot to really worry you about the way in which the country is going and the need for not only social welfare, but better citizenship training. So this is the context in which social studies emerged. So the idea is to make students aware of social problems and to equip them to handle those social problems and perhaps to find solutions to those problems. So by the initial decades of the 20th century, social studies has emerged as a curricular program. It is an integration of history, geography, civics, and the various social sciences, and its aim is to promote civic competence. So you'll notice that history then not only is just one strand within social studies, but it has a different purpose than history prior to the creation of social studies. And I have a slide where I'm going to walk you through that. So notice also that social studies is not a content area. It is an area of inquiry. So the idea was to use the principles of these various disciplines and study social problems and to try to generate solutions or to prepare students to live in the context of those social problems. So again, what we're after is social improvement through citizenship education. So there's some underlying epistemological views embedded in this concept of social studies. And that's this. So this view of social studies curriculum really comes from a 1916 report. It has a really long title. It is actually a National Education Association committee. There are about 9 of them working simultaneously. This particular one focused on social studies. But you'll notice it's sponsored by the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Education. So everybody perceived that there was a need to reform education for the changing context of society and economics. And they wanted some ideas about how to do that. So that's what this committee was designed to do. So the way in which we conceptualize social studies actually can trace its origins back to this report. This is not where social studies was created, but this is the point at which it begins to enter the curriculum. Notice, too, that social studies of the 1916 version is not rooted in history, the discipline of history. If you look at the members of this particular committee, most of them are sociologists. The 2 lead writers, one had a PhD in sociology from Chicago, the other had a PhD in sociology from Columbia. So the social sciences are a new set of disciplines that emerged in the latter part of the 19th century. And they are designed to be what science is. So even as science is giving us all the answers, it's providing all the solutions. If we just keep asking questions and doing experiments, we can solve all our problems. The same thing was true with social sciences. They're using scientific methodology to study humanity. Well, through that study and experimentation, we can do the same thing with humanity. Even as we're improving technology, we can improve humanity by using the social sciences. So this is the view that's implicit in this idea of social studies as it entered the curriculum. So social sciences are going to replace history as the primary focus for citizenship education in the schools. It starts with 1960, but it takes a while to filter into the curriculum because there's still a lot of teachers who were trained the old way. So if you read like educational journals from the early 20th century, there's a range of opinion expressed by the different teachers. All right, so now we're going backwards. So if we look at education at the turn of the 20th century, this is what a typical classroom would look like, probably in a smaller, probably a country school. This is actually from Oklahoma. The landscape is very different, so I have some stats here to kind of put this into perspective for you. In 1899-1900, only 6.4% of secondary-age students earned a high school diploma. In 1909-1910, that's only 8.8%. So think about that. Only 6.4% of young people of secondary school age actually earned a high school diploma. So most students only received an elementary education. And that takes a very long time to change. So this is one of the reasons why there was so much focus on social studies in the elementary school level, because for most students, that's all they got. Many of the students who went to high school, if they completed high school, they were probably, either done or they might be college bound. And the curriculum of the high schools was geared a little bit differently. So our students, however, at the turn of the 20th century are much more homogenous than they are today in 2019. We have different schools, but we don't really have a system yet. So our elementary schools are often called common schools. Sometimes they're called country schools. It depends on which person you pick up, how they're describing them. And The secondary schools are what we could call middle school or high school. The high school actually is just now coming into popularity. So the latter part of the 19th century was when they used to call it the higher school, was coming into popularity. And alongside this, we're also going to have other academies. And remember, we have a lot of Germans at the turn of the 20th century who are still using the gymnasium model. So you don't have a standardized system of education at the turn of the 20th century. You have it, it's public, it's accessible to a lot of people, it's not compulsory, but it's not standardized either. Standardization was the great move of the initial decades of the 20th century, and it pretty much happened in every field that you can think of. So in terms of economics, the United States has just gone through that first wave of industrialization. So the Civil War is going to kick that industrial revolution into high gear. So by the turn of the century, we are an industrialized country, and that's what education is designed to do, is to prepare people for that kind of economy. And then agriculture is still extremely important to the United States. The white-collar sector is very small in comparison with 2019. So again, our emphases are different. In terms of politics, education is still largely a state matter at the turn of the 20th century. There are moves to sort of look at it from a national level, but it really is the responsibility of the states, and it's a local thing at the turn of the 20th century. So what happened to history? Why is it that social studies superseded history as the main vehicle for educating students in citizenship? There's a couple of reasons why that is. I put a couple of quotes. These are from teachers or professors who are engaged in teaching history, and these all come from educational journals. They're actually kind of entertaining. Especially, as a historian, we're always complaining, well, history is always left out. No one ever cares about history. Well, it's not a new thing. In 1871, they were complaining about it. History is not often found receiving much time or attention. But here's the key point I want you to make up. The boy of 16 or 18, who 10 months in the year rarely looks in a book, will not appreciate the study of history when it becomes simply a recitation. So that's telling us something about the subject of history, the way in which it's taught. It's also telling us something about the student. What is it telling us about the student?
They don't read. Telling us that.
Yeah, they don't read. Why? Why don't they read? Yeah, it's a socioeconomic thing, right? It's not an aptitude thing. It's a socioeconomic thing, right? Okay, what is it telling us about the way in which history is taught? Rote memorization of facts, okay? And then again, this comment from 1875, again, the common schools, talking about those elementary schools, it's pretty new. We haven't really had this history thing before. They've been teaching it in the academies and the higher schools, and at the college level, it really focuses on Greek and Romans. It's not really a systematic study either. It's like, they read Livy, and they read Sallust, and they read Thucydides and Herodotus, but it's not really, okay, we're going to start at this date, we're going to walk you all the way through Greek and Roman history. So there were some also things going on in the backdrop, which would explain the demise of history. So here are some more quotes. I love this guy. He wrote like a six-part How to Teach History, 1885. So this is from I think one of the parts of that. Again, it's this idea that there's a strong connection between history and democracy. That we need to understand the origins of our country in order to produce good citizens. But if you look at what this teacher is saying, he's saying that a lot of students don't learn history. They don't really know anything about it. And I thought this, I just giggled when I saw this. To many children, the study of history is extremely distasteful. Things never change. But he says that it's not wrong with the child, it's wrong either with history or with the teacher. So he concludes that history is but a series of tales of human beings. Human beings form the theme which is of all things most congenial to the child's mind. If the subject loses all its charms by our handling, the fault is ours, and we should not blame the child. So once again, what's this telling you about the way in which history is taught?
It's like the entertainment.
It's boring, right? It has nothing to, the students can't see why this is important and why it's meaningful for them. So again, we're still having these arguments about the importance of history. So this one, this is, I think, a great quote. Character and citizenship are the only excuses for education at public expense. So again, this is the argument for why history is important, because it's important in teaching students citizenship, but it also teaches them skills, and it also teaches them morals. This, by the way, if you go down here and look at this, in allowing him to contemplate the men of action in every age, he unconsciously learns to love the good and to hate the evil, and so has his morals strengthened. This is really a Renaissance view of history. This is the way in which they used to teach history, or read history. That's why they used to read history, is exemplar. Good examples, bad examples. We should emulate this, we should avoid that. So again, you can see in the teachers who are writing about this from 1871 until 1908, don't have identical views about what history is, but we agree it's important. This is also, I think, interesting. So this is the character. This is basically linking character and citizenship. So we have to understand the struggles of the fathers for the liberty which he now enjoys. His soul, you notice his soul is stirred with patriotism, and a determination is formed not only to preserve it to posterity, but to pass it on unmarred by any act of his. So do you see what's being emphasized there is the responsibility of citizenship, not the rights of citizenship. So if you go back and look at that 2019 version of social studies, what are we tending to emphasize? The rights, your rights, not your responsibilities. Okay, so this is kind of on one slide, what's going on. So the complication, and one of the reasons why history was superseded by social studies, particularly at the elementary school level, has to do with what's going on in history. So one of the things we have to remember is, I'm going to try to summarize what I usually take half a semester in my historical methods class to talk about. There are really two ways to look at history. One is history is the past. And the past remains unchanged. Whether or not we know anything about it, it still happened, it's still back there. That's what happened in the past. The other way to look at history is the record of that past. What we know about that past, how we know it. So it's the record part that changes. It's not the past that changes. It's the way in which we perceive and write about the past that changes. So in the 19th century, there's a lot of stuff going on in the way in which we are conceiving of the record of history. So first of all, let me just mention, I'm going to skip down to the bottom. Prior to the second half of the 19th century, you could not get a degree in history. It was offered at the university, at the college, but it's not its own academic area, so you can't get a BA in history, okay? This is the invention of the Germans with the creation of the research university, which happened in Germany in the 19th century. So there's one significant thing to note about that. The research university, as it was formed by the Germans, was about the creation of new knowledge. Not the preservation of the transmission of existing knowledge. It was about the creation of new knowledge, right? Okay, think history. You saw why history would have a problem? Because what is history? Well, it's the stuff that already happened, right? So historians then want to make history an academic subject. So they're going to apply scientific principles to it. They're going to create a methodology. Leopold von Ranke is really the lead name in that regard, and what he wanted history is an academic discipline that is based in the archives. So even as scientists do experiments in labs to develop evidence, which they can then use to support a theory, historians go to the archives. That's where their evidence is. That's their laboratory. And so what the historian then does is collect as many facts as possible, assemble them all together, and that's history. And I have a German quote on a later slide that talks about that view of history. Now, why that's important is there's no interpretation of history there. It's just an amassing of facts. And if you go back to those earlier social studies models and the views of history, what kind of history are we being taught? That, right? We're being taught this collection of facts. Okay. All right, so history as it's developing, particularly as we're having discussions about how to integrate it into the curriculum of the schools. It's an emphasis upon Western civilization. This is what the kids need to know. They need to know something about the Western heritage. But at the same time, historical writing is influenced by some isms: imperialism, nationalism, and romanticism. So what we get is national history. And I don't mean just history of the United States. I mean history of the United States is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So the Germans have their versions, the French have their versions, the English have their versions. And so that it's all affected by those isms. So once again, we're getting an interpretation of history that's colored by these isms. There's always been a strong connection between history and democracy. If you go back to read the Founding Fathers, for example, Jefferson talked about the importance of history for democracy. He said that the cost of democracy is eternal vigilance, and that vigilance is helped by history. History is also perceived as a study of humanity. And then we're also going to have scientific history, which is not exactly what von Ranke was doing. Henry Adams wrote A History of the United States. If you read that book, it's interesting because he starts off with numbers. He starts off with population stats. He starts off with economic numbers. He probably tells you how many cattle are in the United States in any given year. So that's what I mean by scientific history. We're trying to do what scientists do by giving lots of quantitative data, right, on which to write our account. Meanwhile, while history is trying to figure out what it is, social studies is emerging as a much more coherent thing. So I've already walked you through this, right? So it's emerging as a response to those social and economic issues. It is part of a larger social welfare reform movement. It coincides with the rise of the social sciences, but it is impacted by the Enlightenment and Darwinism. And I'm gonna talk about that in just a second. So it also has an understanding that the purpose of government is to improve social conditions. This is not the view of government that we see in the Founding Fathers. It is not the view of government that's reflected in the founding documents, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights. So again, be aware that that's a view of government that's embedded into social studies. Okay, so now I want to talk about how the way in which that modern view of history, which has been incorporated into the curriculum of the state-accredited schools, how that differs in some profound ways from the Christian view of history. So let's talk about the modern view of history. So the influence of the Enlightenment, I want to give you one example here. It's Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So I want to talk about the quote in just a minute, but let's talk about the title of that book. What's it about? Yeah, it's about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, okay? Now, why that's significant is because up until this moment, when we looked at Rome, we looked at it as a fund of examples, of wisdom, of models, of, gosh, we're having this problem with government. Let's go see what the Romans did. Or, gee, we want to write this lovely poem. Let's see what the Romans did, right? So the Greeks and the Romans were our examples. We look back to them for inspiration. What is Gibbon telling us about the Roman Empire? Not only is it gone, yeah, you know, it was okay, but it wasn't really that great. And in fact, in one of the lines he says, rather than be surprised that the Roman Empire fell, we should rather wonder it had subsisted for so long.
He also hates Christianity.
Oh yes, well he's responding to Augustine. He's in conversation with Augustine. I think that Augustine gets the better of him. But I recommend you should read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. If nothing else for his English prose, he is such a wonderful writer. He actually had a classical education, which comes out in his writing. He's trained in rhetoric. He's trained in grammar. He's trained in Greek and Latin, so it comes through in his English vocabulary, and our English vocabulary these days is really sad and deleted. Go back and read it and choose some of his words. Now let's look at this quote. This is the last sentence of the section called General Observations on the Fall of the Roman Empire in the West. All right, I'm going to read it because I'm not sure if everyone can see it. We may therefore acquiesce in the pleasing conclusion that every age of the world has increased and still increases the real wealth, the happiness, the knowledge, and perhaps the virtue of the human race. What's he saying? There's the word. What happens to humanity over time? It progresses. It doesn't just improve materially. You know, we don't just get better stuff, running water, that sort of thing. We get better virtue. We become better. So we are superior to the people who preceded us because of this notion of progress. Now, if you believe that, what happens to your view of history? What's that?
We're better than everything.
Yeah, so what's the point of studying past? You can't learn anything from it. We've superseded them, okay? Then we're going to throw in the influence of modern science. Notice how we're changing how we use history. History was not to judge the past in order to instruct the present for the benefit of the future. What historians should be doing is telling the story, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, as it really was. We're not going to make judgments. We're not going to draw conclusions. We're just going to assemble the facts, and we're going to give them to you, and what you do with them, that's up to you. Now, do facts speak for themselves? No, the historian must make them speak. Is it possible to collect every single fact ever known to man? So you're going to end up selecting facts. You're either going to choose to put some in, or you're going to choose to leave some out. So what you're actually doing is offering an interpretation, but you're pretending like you're being objective. Has anyone ever read one of these 19th century histories, like Leopold von Zwanke? He wrote actually the Reformation. What did you think about it?
Well, he spends most of his time telling you where he got his facts from. I went all the way to Venice, and I studied at the archives, and I read this.
He wants to impress you with his research, right? And they're really long. I mean, they're like this long. I mean, seriously. Because that's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to collect the facts and then make them accessible to the reader. We have long involved conversations in my methods class about historical facts. They don't really exist, but anyway. So we're not trying to interpret, at least this is what we're saying we're doing, but what we're actually doing is not what we're saying we're doing. So if that's pretty obvious, right, to people that what we're saying we're doing is not really what we're doing. So how does that impact the discipline as a whole? Well, you're not objectively scientists. I mean, you don't have to pretend you are, but you're really not. Right, so it has a tendency of discrediting history. Okay. And then you want to throw in, I mentioned these already, the influence of world events, romanticism, nationalism, and progressivism. All of those are going to impact the way in which history is written, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century. And we're going to throw in 2 world wars for flavoring. Okay, so how does that impact the Christian view of history? Why is it important for Christians to understand this, particularly educators? Why is it important for us to know this when we're teaching history? I'm going to pull a couple of quotes here. Reinhold Niebuhr is one of my favorite authors on this particular topic. In 1949, he published a collection of essays called Faith in History. I recommend everyone to get a copy of that. He is not an easy read. I have 2 possible explanations, well, 3. He grew up in a German-speaking household, so his probably syntax was affected by German. I tend to think he's doing what Augustine did in the City of God. If you read Augustine's City of God in the Latin, the first 10 books, the Latin is very different. It's Ciceronian. It's rhetorical. It is thick. It is, wow, he really knows what he's talking about. Because his audience is the pagans. He is attacking the pagans, and he's completely deconstructing, demolishing their positions on pretty much any question you can think of. The second part of the City of God is written for Christians. And the Latin is very different. It's simple, it's approachable. So I think Niebuhr is trying to do the same thing. He is responding to modernists. But the modernists he's responding to are the most dangerous. They are inside the church. So what he wants to tell them is, hey, I am just as educated as you are. In fact, I'm smarter than you are. So you can't tell me that I don't know anything. So anyway, Niebuhr is worth a read, but you have to kind of struggle to figure out what he's saying. So this is what he says. Modern culture is particularly offended by the claim of finality in any disclosure of the ultimate and an antecedent point of history. Okay, pause for a minute. What does that mean?
God is involved.
What's that?
God is involved.
Yeah, so what is the modern view? Offended by the claim of finality, so final meaning the end, of disclosure of the ultimate, at an antecedent point in history. So who is he really talking about?
It's contemporary, modern.
Okay, this is what I was telling my students. If you never know the answer, a good thing to always say is, Jesus! This is what he's talking about. He's talking about, so the end of history actually happened at the beginning. It happened with Christ. Okay, so I'll have to read it to you. Partly because, so the modern culture is offended by the claim of finality of any disclosure of the ultimate at an antecedent point of history, partly because it believes that history itself changes the human situation radically. Progress. And partly because it hopes the historical culture will be able to refine and perfect any valid solution of whatever may be perennial in the human situation. So not only does human nature progress, it gets better, well, if we still have problems, we can fix them. We can figure it out. It's going to happen inside the context of history. The basis for this hope of modern culture is the belief that there is no essential difference between the stuff of history and the stuff of nature, and therefore no real distinction between the application of the scientific method to nature and to history. So, yeah, can you hear Darwin in that? So even as the belief in evolution, that creatures change, improve, evolve over time, the same thing is true of humans. And so that ultimately within human history, we will reach perfection. So Niebuhr's saying that's ridiculous. So here's another quote from, so the New Testament makes the startling claim that in Christ, history has achieved both its end and a new beginning. The affirmation that Christ is the end of history signifies that in his life, death, and resurrection, the meaning of man's historic existence is fulfilled. There is a reason why we're here, and it has to do with Christ. History has meaning because of Christ. Everything that we do as Christians has meaning because of Christ. So the thing to remember is man remains a creature of nature on every stage of his development. Niebuhr talks about, in several of his essays, that man is simultaneously the creature and creator of history. Remember, man has free will. So we make decisions, most of the time they're the wrong ones, but we still make them. That's the creator part of history. But we are simultaneously a creature of history. We can't control our destiny. We can't solve problems. We can't fix ourselves. There are certain bounds of human finiteness which no historical development can overcome. The preoccupation of modern culture with the remarkable increase in human power and freedom has inclined modern men to deny and to defy these fixed limits. So in other words, we think that we can figure it out. Just give us enough time and we'll figure it out. We don't need God. So here's George Marsden does a lot of work on Christian education at the higher levels, and he wrote this article specifically for teachers of history. But he said that history is it's not only it's a record of God's acting in history. And so the Christian belongs in that continuing action of God in human history. So the Christian must view himself as participating in an ongoing active relationship between God and man, in which the revelation of God's acts and will in the past provides continuing norms for creative responses to the present. But I think here's the key point that he makes about history. History is of major importance in alerting us to the transitory character of many of the values of our own ancient culture. If you don't know what we believe or have believed in the past, when you see something new, you don't recognize it as new. Rather, that unknowingly allowing our values to be conformed to passing contemporary standards, we can strive to evaluate our current cultural norms intelligently and to apply them to the transforming values of Christ. So once again, Christ is the standard. Christ gives us the model, gives us we should look at everything through the lens of Christ. This is one of my favorite quotes. Buttrick, he was a pastor in, I think it's in New York. He was actually Presbyterian, but he says some really profound things about history. This is like one of my favorites. History is dialogue between God and man. The teaching of history is dull because we have turned history into a monologue, man talking to himself. A monologue is always dull after the first few minutes. Soon it makes no sense. Then history becomes a recitation of successive dynasties, a deadly memorizing of kings and dates and battles. Humanist history has no depth. It's a flat land of man's doings, with no mysterious soundings, no sky, no mountains of mortality, to decay our wonder about what lies beyond death. So I like that image of dialogue. History is dialogue. Niebuhr calls it a drama, but I kind of like dialogue because it implies that there is an active role for man in that relationship with God. So, the basic reason why we as Christians should teach and learn history is to better understand ourselves. It's to better understand others. If the chief obligation of the Christian is to love, having some understanding of those people that we're trying desperately to love can help. So if we are going to love others, it seems evident that we should try our best to understand them. And then I'm going to close with this one. Just to show you this is not a new idea, Philip von Leitgeb said some of the very same things back in the 16th century. He's reflecting it's a kind of a combination of an Augustinian Renaissance view of history. So for him, history is the record of not only God's promises to his people, but the fulfillment of those promises. So if we don't keep a record of it, we don't know when it happens. So, our closing image. So when we're creating our worldview, this is what it should look like. Thank you. I'll take questions now. Questions? Yeah.
I think one of the values, of many values of studying history, is to think through the issues that happened in the past. For example, the right and wrong of the American Revolution, the right and wrong of President Truman dropping an atomic bomb on cities that included non-combatants. Evaluating those, and then the history of the theory of the just war. So those have enduring application in every age, those types of issues, and to read the arguments that were going on.
Right, and so, one of the goals also of historical studies is to develop historical empathy with the past. So, what we don't want to do is to take our values, our 21st century values, and apply them on the past. Like, oh, weren't those people stupid for having slavery? Don't we know that slavery is just wrong? Well, if you go back and look at the 19th century, they looked at the world very differently, and so we have to be careful about, judging the past according to our own standards.
But isn't that going on right now with the tearing down of Confederate monuments that, like for Robert E. Lee, which the Northern people wanted to sort of heal the wounds of the Civil War, to make peace with the South? Yeah,
it is really dangerous to erase your history. Ask the French. They did it in the French Revolution. They have not recovered. If you look at French history, does anyone know how many governments the French had in the 19th century alone? 5. Yeah, so erasing history isn't going to solve the problem. We have to confront it. We have to, and nobody's perfect. And that's what I find kind of, that's not really amusing, it's kind of frustrating. Everyone has to be perfect in order to be respected. I'm like, it's not really the way it works.
Just an observation, knowing that you're a member of faculty in a department that has its historical origins in higher education in the German Research University, and we can think about the sorrow of losing departments of history through the CUS right now as well, and liberal arts in general,
Yep.
etc. I guess my question would be to you, hey, Where should humanities curriculum, or excuse me, where should a history curriculum exist in higher ed? Should it be in the humanities curriculum? Should it be in the behavioral sciences curriculum? Or should it be its own college?
You know, it's really funny because when we back in the day, we used to have division, and I used to get, as department chair, I used to get pieces of mail from the same publisher.
Yep.
One piece of mail would be addressed to me, Department of History, Division of Social Sciences. Another piece of mail, identical thing, to me, History Department, Division of Humanities.
Yep.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting, we had actually talked at one point at MECWAN about combining political science and history, and in a lot of places, those two are combined, because there's a lot of natural affinity between the two. But the research methodology is actually really different between political science and history.
Yeah.
I personally think it's humanity, because I think it's the study of humanity. I mean, I think that the point of studying history is to understand human nature, not to predict it, but it's just so when people do things, you're not surprised by it. Because they're just being people. Any other questions or comments?
So history, degree in history, as opposed to a degree in liberal arts. I mean, if you're weighing apples and oranges, and you're trying to give your kids advice, what do you do?
Well, do you mean like a degree in liberal, like a degree in liberal arts?
That's the
or-
other hard part, is what kind of a liberal arts degree? I mean, there's very select colleges that I would consider sending a kid to for a liberal arts degree.
Well, there aren't very many places, to my knowledge, that have what I would consider a good liberal arts degree. The one we have in the catalog is dreadful. I have no idea how it got in there. I'm trying my best to get it out because it's not a liberal arts.
Well, King's College in London offers a degree in history, and I'm thinking, you know, as a correspondence school for a kid who has been brought up with history and is familiar with it, that it might be an option because they do things differently and they approach it a little differently than I think.
Well, you know, again, it depends. If you're talking about history of the United States, there is a difference between the way it's approached at the larger research, the R1s, the research universities, and the way it's approached at smaller liberal arts colleges. It's not just class sizes. There is more, some of my students are really can speak to this. There is more flexibility in the way in which the history majors are structured at the smaller schools. And there is more direct contact with the faculty. I know this because my older son is a history major at UW-Madison. And it's for him, it's been, I mean, he has better resources than we have. But the interchange between the students and the faculty is very different at the larger schools than it is at the smaller schools. Also at the smaller schools, students can create individualized majors. So I've had a lot of students who have done all kinds of interesting combinations. I had one do a major in, well, we now have a classical studies major, but I've had students do a combination of history and art, or history and languages, or in combination. So to think about history, it is the all-encompassing discipline. There's a history of everything. So if you use history as the label, you can create any kind of program really that you want based upon the selection of courses. My suggestion is to make sure they have a capstone course which involves a senior thesis, preferably with a public presentation of that work. Right, guys? Yes.
Actually, Concordia MECWAN has its base not in the German research university, but in the gymnasium, in the liberal arts approach. And I think part of the problem of history is the German research model, which is so hyper-specialized that you zero in on one, and you still see this in a lot of the big universities. You know a whole lot about very little, and there's no connections. Whereas the liberal arts, I think there's a liberal arts approach to history that you're embodying in the point that everything has a history. History could be a way to tie things together. There's history of art, there's history of science, there's history of education, there's history of the disciplines that you've just shown us, and history, church history, and if you look at history just as political history, well, you're getting one.
That's just only one slice. Well, and you know, history is a way in which to read literature. Because literature has more meaning when you read it in a historical context.
I consider myself a literary historian, And so, to me, that's kind of the liberal arts approach to look at, you can say this as a part of the humanities, but you're looking at as human beings through time and the different things they.
Yeah, because what you're looking for is patterns, right?
Right.
And the advantage of teaching at a liberal arts college, is, I'm routinely trotting through 1,000 years of history in a semester. And so I see patterns that I think historians who are working in just one really small specialized field just don't see. And so for me, I actually have this great quote from Robert E. Lee. He wrote it in fact, I'm going to read it to you because it's such a great quote. He says, "My experience of man has neither disposed me to think worse of them, nor indisposed me to serve them, nor in spite of failures which I lament, of errors which I now see and acknowledge," he wrote this in 1870. "And of the present aspect of affairs, do I despair of the future? The truth is this: the march of Providence is so slow, and our desires so impatient, the work of progress so immense, and our means of aiding it so feeble, the life of humanity is so long, that of the individual so brief, that we often see only the ebb of the advancing wave and are thus discouraged. It is history that teaches us to hope." So another way of thinking about this is, as a historian, I never panic when things happen, because I'm like, oh yeah, you've been here before.
It seems like there's another issue with history right now, especially in higher education. And you alluded to it, but the use of history as a way to critique the present. For example, I've seen this, we can't take the Declaration of Independence seriously when it talks about inalienable rights and men are created equal because Jefferson owned slaves. Now, and some are taking it to the point of, like we heard about, not even erasing that part of the history, not having any monuments to Jefferson, because as Christians, I think, have a more sophisticated and complex view of human beings. That, right, we know perfection is impossible. There will be moral failures even in our great heroes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the other things that they did or may have written, may not have value themselves. But you look at it in a complex way. But there's a tendency, I've seen this in literary studies, to demonize the past, to show that, well, America is nothing more than one group oppressing another, and all of these nice things, these are masks to hide and justify their power, exercise of power over others. And so that hurts history, because why study it? What can you get if it's nothing more than something so ugly wrong?
Well, there are Lutheran views of history. Yaroslav Pelikan wrote a two-part essay for the Crescent back in the 1950s. This is before he became Orthodox. But he conceptualized this law and gospel. So history is a record of the law. So it's okay. Here's God's law. Here is numerous examples of our failure to live up to that law. But here's the gospel. Here's God in history redeeming humanity. So I think that Christians should take from history this knowledge of human nature, not only learning ourselves better, but also other people. I mean, it should promote understanding. So when someone does something that really irritates you, you're like, Thoughts, questions, comments? Thank you. Thank you for your attention.